IVM.
Hey, welcome to Shunya One, episode 36. We have someone with us today and we're going to talk about some interesting stuff like the design approach to building products, also about how VCs and angel investors look at funding, and of course, what else is next in the space of products in India.
I actually thought we got into some really interesting stuff over here about how India specific products are built differently. So I thought that's a really kind of
so
interesting
Shoaib's
part
going
of
to
the
be with
conversation
us
there.
to talk about that. But before we get in, what's happening on our Slack channel?
So we had quite a bit of stuff going on Slack this week. VS Vivek had a pretty interesting comment. This was in basically he put it in the episodes channel underneath the Ankush episode. So this is his comment. Extremely insightful for us, the bubble people. Surely puts in perspective the challenge we have while building for us in a more native manner. Loved Ankush stating that we are similar to our neighbors more than China. Been a little irritating seeing media cover China as our next source of copying. If that was the case, why would they bother investing in our companies in the first place? Would love to know other people's thoughts on this. So hey, people, get on Slack and give him your thoughts on what you think of this.
Yep, and I think we're going to jump into a bit of that while talking to Shoaib as well.
Conversation as well, yes.
Yep, so let's get on with the show.
Hey, so today we have Soaib Grewal, the venture partner at T Labs and Times Internet with us. How are you doing, Soaib?
Doing well.
So I think we've been friends for a while, right?
We're on talking terms.
Oh, really?
You've been more than friends.
Oh, my God.
That's very suggestive, Amit.
But great, man. I mean, so happy to do this. And yes, literally on talking terms now because you don't show up in Bombay anymore and we had to get you over the phone.
You guys don't give me enough reasons to show up in Bombay.
My goodness. He's just loving them back.
No, man, I'm super excited. This is a long time coming, so I'm excited to be doing this.
Yes, and in fact, you're not so unfamiliar with the podcasting space yourself. I believe you used to have one at some point.
I've recorded all of 2 episodes.
That's 2 episodes more than Sheila had even heard 6 months ago.
Exactly. So, hey, it's good to be part of this community, and I think we're growing, and thanks so much for doing this. But just a little bit more background for everyone listening in. You've been a design mentor at Microsoft's Accelerator and a venture partner at 500 startups. And you've obviously run your own fund called Bold, where you were kind enough to be a wonderful investor for Hipcask. And so why don't you just tell us about a little bit of the story so far and how has the investor life been?
Sure. So story so far is not completely straightforward, but the dots sort of connect when I share it with people. So I've spent the last 3 years on the investment side of things, both through a couple of different stints. First, of course, was with a small investment firm that I started called Bold. Which was essentially a design-driven or design-led investment firm, and what that meant actually was that I saw a very large gap for helping companies with design in India. I noticed that there were a lot of companies that needed help, but the models and modalities of doing it were not necessarily so suitable. Most startups at an early stage can't really afford designers to help them out with product, but design in itself could be really game-changing for a startup if they do it well at the early stage. So that's why Bold came about, where we'd invest in companies, help them with product, help them with design, user research, strategy, and just be kind of hands-on through the process. After that, I actually developed a very good relationship with Pankaj Jain of 500 Startups. So, over my investment at Bold. Bold, we were actively investing for about a year or so. And Pankaj and I still have a ton of mutual respect for one another. And as 500 was looking to do more in India, He was a fan of what we were up to at Bold, and we sort of joined forces with 500, and I became a venture partner over there, looking at India, helping companies out with design, doing design programs across the region, a few internationally as well with 500's portfolio companies. And then finally, leading to me joining Times Internet, which I think your listeners might be a little familiar with because my colleague Nitin has done an episode with you guys.
Right.
And if you need me to give a refresher on what Times Internet is, please let me know, and I'd be happy to do that. But my role at Times Internet is essentially working at the investment office over here in the investment team, which is a fairly small team. We're about 6 of us, 3 people on the investment side, 3 people on the sort of ops side. And as some people may know, we've been operating one of India's, I'd say, oldest accelerators called T Labs, which has been very successful over the last few years, but at the same time doing a lot of sort of minority investments like a typical VC would in later stage companies and, Series A, Series B. Prior to investment, I actually I began my professional life, if you will, as an entrepreneur, actually. I started a social impact company called Waterwalla, which was sort of marrying tech with grassroots business to figure out solutions to the clean water problem in urban India. Did that for about 3 years. So I started it off while I was still in college. Did that for about 3 years. Moved on from there and went back to my roots, which was actually design. I went to school for design. I studied industrial design at the Rhode Island School of Design in the States. And I decided to go back to that and get my hands dirty and, working with a lot of different companies, working with VCs in their portfolios, working with accelerators like Microsoft, and helping startups out mostly. And that's sort of what led me back to the startup side of things with Bold. So spent a little bit of time as an entrepreneur, a little bit of time as an operator and helping companies out with design. And now the last few years have been mostly on the investment side.
Wow. So wonderful. I think that's a great roundup. And since you mentioned, right, design, I know when you were doing Bold, the whole focus of helping entrepreneurs or early stage companies was a design first sort of an approach, right? And something fundamentally as a focus area, very unique in terms of what other VCs at the time or even now sort of approach with. So obviously your design school background there was what led to it. But how, as a first question, like how important do you think this still is? Not just design is, when I say design, obviously it doesn't just mean UI as such, right? It's user experience, it's everything. How essential do you think this is for an early stage company? And do you think India has caught up with what do Indian founders do they understand design thinking as a way forward in building products today?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think design thinking itself is a very loaded word, so I personally like to stay away from it. But no, it is, man. It is like
I think it was it's like what we say about food tech or bitcoins or whatever.
Hey, Bitcoin's not loaded, dude.
There's no loading to that word at all.
Yeah, not at all. There are a couple of different things. There are a couple of ways that I want to answer this. First of all, I think that are we quite there, or do Indian founders understand design better than when I started helping people out back in 2012, 2013? For sure. Back then, I think there was a fundamental fight of explaining why is design relevant. Now the fight has sort of changed, where it's not about why is it relevant, but how indeed can you integrate it in your processes? How do you ensure that it is a cornerstone of you building product? Because I think what happened was that a lot of companies were either the design itself, especially consumer design, has become quite commoditized. And what I mean by that is it's not too hard for someone to see a template of a UI template for an app or a website that is fairly successful, and then just copying it off, right? So I think that worked fairly well early on for a lot of companies in India. And then over time, what happened was that, come say a Series A, you really start caring about design, and then you're like, oh shit, I need to actually change things up.
I need to hire a designer.
Or I need to hire a designer. I need to hire a firm. And basically what you were doing is the designer or the firm had to go back and essentially rebuild or recreate an experience out of something that was really built in a very piecemeal approach, right? I mean, that's essentially how you build product at early stages. You come up with an MVP and you're constantly iterating upon it. Now, if you don't take a very holistic approach from day one to think about the user experience, you end up with something which is, it just way too feature rich, where things don't connect to one another, where things are broken, and designers started having a very tough time. So I think the challenge has changed a little bit, but Indian founders, I think, are definitely a lot more cognizant of it. They're definitely a lot more cognizant. A lot of people are putting more time into it. I think that, my fundamental belief I'd say the fundamental thesis at Bold was that many Indian founders and good Indian founders, especially product-driven founders or brand-driven founders, have a natural inclination towards design, think like designers, work like designers, but they may not share the same vocabulary. So our goal at that point was really how do you provide them with the necessary vocabulary, the necessary skill set, and the necessary tools so they could become self-sufficient. And basically just carry on what they were doing with more attention to detail. And I think that's essentially where a lot of good product founders are right now in India. And, back in the day, I think you could count the number of companies that you would admire from a design point of view on one hand. I'd like to think that has increased now. And I think that, moreover, it's becoming more and more relevant, in fact. It's becoming more and more relevant because those templates that I'd mentioned early on, those are no longer applicable to, I'd say, the next 500 million, 600 million people who are going to come online, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Simple things like hamburger menus, where to put the search bar, or even the experience around search. Those are all things that are essentially web legacies, right? We've taken web UI and sort of just compressed it for mobile phones. And that worked for a lot of digital natives who were just going from from web to mobile. But for everyone who's coming online for the first time, there are inherent UX problems for users that are coming online for the first time. So what that means is that if we're really thinking about creating products and services that are going to impact the lives of the next 500 million people coming online in India, we're going to have to take a much more user-driven approach. Design is going to start meaning a lot more. And I think that's the exciting part too, right? So I think that if the large amount of growth online over the next few years is going to happen in India, or international growth online is going to happen, be powered through India, I think we also have the ability to then create certain design standards that people in other markets will start emulating and start looking at for inspiration, whether it's Southeast Asia or Africa or any of the other emerging markets, right? So I think we have the ability to start creating standards for a lot of people in the world. So that, for me, as a designer and as an investor, is actually very, very exciting.
So, Soaib, can I ask you to give, could you give us an example of like something that you feel like is very Indian in nature that we haven't really, that's basically kind of evolved from the use cases that exist over here? Because I keep hearing about the point that you're making, right? That design needs to be focused on the local user and that kind of thing. But I've had a little bit of trouble kind of figuring out, like, what does that mean really?
Sure. So I'll give you one example. Sure. It's something I've been thinking about over the last few months, actually. And that's actually, social media. Mm-hmm. I think that social media and social experiences for first-time mobile users in India are very different than, say, Western users, right? All of us people who are digital natives, we're fairly comfortable with social media practices that are sort of more Western-centric, whereas social media practices in India, I'd say, are are fairly unique to India. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. I think social media overall, digital social media, is nothing but an enhancement or a replication of offline social practices, right?
Okay.
And so essentially, spaces that are created online are allowing us to replicate or further enhance our offline social behavior. And for those of us who were perhaps Western educated or have been online for a very long time, we can understand some of the nuances of say, a Facebook or Twitter, or why that's even relevant to someone like us. But for someone who's coming online for the first time, those things might just be slightly meaningless, right? What is social interaction in parts of India? Social interaction over here is it's collective. It's slightly voyeuristic. It happens at the tea stall. It happens at the street corner. It doesn't happen in contained spaces like restaurants and bars and people's living rooms. And I think that a lot of that's why a lot of investors over the last few years have been saying, what does social mean in India? And I believe that while Facebook and WhatsApp have done a good job of being relevant for a lot of Indian consumers, I think there are a lot of other things that they haven't been able to that they had not been able to achieve. And the belief amongst a lot of investors was that there will be a Twitter for India, or there will be a Facebook for India that'll be homegrown, that'll be far better suited for Indian consumers. And what happened? That necessarily wasn't the case, right? WhatsApp ended up becoming a social media platform in India,
right,
which is for the rest of the world a messaging app, right? Mm-hmm. If you look at the other side, everyone believed that things like ShareChat would become social platforms. And in my opinion, you could argue it. Some people say it is a social platform. I don't think it quite is. What's happening is you have applications and products like Bigo Live that are essentially turning into social media apps over here in India, where video in itself is a social media app. Yeah. Now, people like you and me would never actually quite understand how would live streaming be a social behavior, or how does that facilitate social behavior? But if you just look at the kind of things people are doing on apps like Bigo, it is indeed social media for that large demographic, and it has to do with the fact that it actually really replicates or facilitates real offline Indian social behavior, which, like I said, is a group activity. It's voyeuristic. It's many to one. It's not 100% private. There's a sort of semi-private space to it, or private-public gray space, if you will. So I think that is one sort of emerging use case for me that is fairly exciting. I think that social media there could be a very interesting space over the next few years, or at least apps and platforms that facilitate different sort of social interactions for India.
Yeah, in fact, it's funny that you mentioned ShareChat, because we just spoke to the ShareChat founder last week. And I think we had the similar conversation there, right? Because they also started out thinking of it as a chat platform, but just like everyone else, they're looking at how it's obviously evolving into a more social platform. And yes, video is huge. Video post our geoification of the country has been just exploding. So people are using that as an absolute mirror of the real world, I think.
Oh yeah, for sure. So I don't know if that completely answers your question, Amit, but that's one sort of.
Yeah, no, but that's a great idea. That's a great point towards what I was asking, which was, this was just, I was trying to figure out, when people talk about we need to make it local and we need to make it local friendly, that doesn't come with many specifics generally, right?
And it's not just language. Yeah.
Exactly. When people think about localization, unfortunately, they say that, it's just about translation or transliteration, but that's not quite the case.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, wow. So that's a very interesting insight. So obviously, you're taking some of this into cognizance when you're talking to founders today, and there's a certain outlook towards more and more founders and products building things in this space, right?
Yes, for sure. By this space, you mean for
India, for the larger audience, for Bharat, as we call it, we've been top of the pyramid, or rather the term bubble people is what we've been.
Bubble people, that's the
word.
Yes,
but I take I have a problem with the term Bharat. A lot of VCs throw it around. The reason I have trouble with it is primarily, I almost see it as I see it as slightly derogatory. I see it as derogatory, and I see it as this weird othering that we're doing to a large mass of people who, are no different from us in terms of what they want to do online. It's just that they're at a very different entry point on the S curve, right? They're at a very different entry point. So, and I also think that it applies this weird geofencing, which isn't the case either, right?
Wow,
the next 500 million people.
So strongly, man. Sorry to interrupt, but I just agree with that so strongly. I mean, I keep hearing Bharat, and it just annoys me every time I hear it.
It's fetishization, dude. It really is, and I think it's a disconnect that a lot of people have because like I said, it implies this weird geofencing, which isn't the case, right? Bharat doesn't mean tier 2, it doesn't mean Jabalpur, right? Bharat, I mean, that's what they're implying, right?
Yeah.
But which I find very stupid because the next 500 million people also include people who live in the big cities.
Yep.
There are people who live in Bombay and Delhi who are just getting online for the first time. So I think that we have a certain responsibility as investors and people in the tech ecosystem to use the right terms. Otherwise, people are going to get confused. And I also think it doesn't give enough respect to that user, in my opinion.
No, and I think this othering is dangerous, right? This idea of creating this other that, this is not us, but we need to build for them. And I mean, like when you start thinking of things in that kind of separated space, I just don't think that you're going to come out with good things out of that.
I completely agree with you.
Absolutely. On that interesting note, I think we should take a quick break and come back and talk some more about what are these early stage challenges and what the outlook is on India. We'll take a quick break and come back.
Hey friend, so if you're listening to a podcast right now, you're probably some kind of a nerd at heart at least. So maybe, just maybe, you might like another podcast about nerds, by nerds, and for nerds.
It's called Geek Fruit, a community to unite estranged geeks from across India and later on the world. We talk about television, movies, science fiction, adventure, fantasy, etc. Anything nerdy, it's all here on Geek Fruit.
You can catch a fresh episode every Monday, and you can check us out on any of your favorite podcast apps, like my favorite podcast app, the IVM podcast app. Give me my money, IVM.
Good plug.
Happy listening, you nerds.
All right, welcome back. I think our conversation got really serious about how VCs are not the people who should be defining keywords about the Indian audience. Wow.
No. Don't misquote me. I'm not saying VC should not be defining. I think that we should just be more careful in the language that we use when we're defining user segments in India.
Yeah, the second we start talking about Bharat, Nashila, what happens is I feel like it becomes really reductive. It's like these people don't know shit, so we're going to teach them what shit is. And it's just kind of like, it's not a good, it doesn't feel good.
You're talking down to people.
Yeah.
I really feel that term is derogatory. They may not mean it to be, but it comes across that way.
And even if it's not meant to say that, right? I mean, like the fact that attitude exists is problematic in and of itself, right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
True. So, in fact, since you're mentioning this, right, what, as a VC now, or you've been an investor for a while, what do VCs typically look at? So, I've been always on the founder side of things, and we know you guys give us money, but essentially, beyond mapping trends like this, looking at what audiences are there who are coming online or who need to be addressed and so on, right? How do you go about understanding what's a great investment? I mean, I know it's a weird, huge, broad question, but I think everyone sort of wants to know how VCs think. And since you've been part of small to big organizations today at TIL, what do you think you've seen?
It's a tricky question because I wish there was a magic formula or a rubric or a cheat sheet that I could keep going back to. Also, it's a bit tough because it's also I think it's case by case. I think that it's easy to say that we look at founder and then product and this and that, but I think that you're really talking about a couple of different levers that swing in different ways and have different weightages depending on the sector, the space, and how much conviction you also have for a certain area, and of course the stage at which you're investing. So I think above all, though, thinking about or really thinking clearly about whether you think the opportunity could lead to a large outcome for yourself and your stakeholders and people and the money that you're managing is the number one filter for any VC. That's how you've identified sectors and spaces in the first place. And I think that it's something that entrepreneurs perhaps should be a little bit more cognizant of, because a large outcome companies that do not lead to large outcomes aren't necessarily bad companies. And there is a reason why VCs divide companies into VC-backable companies and lifestyle companies.
In fact, it's interesting you mentioned, right? Because we have, obviously, Miten has been here before, and we spoke to him about corporate investing from how a corporate VC like KIL invests, of course, specifically. But since you've been an angel yourself, you've run a small firm. We've had other angel investors come here and talk about the angel angle. So it'll be interesting for you to give us a little perspective on how the viewpoints differ from stage to stage, I guess, like you were just saying.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you how I think about it, because we're actually we do multi-stage investing here at TIL. We run T Labs, which used to be an accelerator, but now is sort of a continuous rolling incubation program. We do seed investing, Series A, Series B. So there are different ways that I end up looking at things, and I think at an early stage, say two guys and a dog, if you will, you're taking a bet on a couple of different things. You may have you're taking a bet, of course, on the people. You're taking a bet on the solution, but in many cases, you're also taking a bet on the larger opportunity or the market or the space. You're investing in companies that are perhaps not riding any trends, but are potentially going to set trends, might create brand new industries. So, of course, the level of risk is far higher. And at that point, I think the only thing that you as an investor have to really bank on is your conviction in the founders. So at the earliest stages, you're taking a bet on the founders and their ability to actually have some sort of vision and see it through, and see the vision through really immaculate and excellent execution. And I think this is where the whole assessing founder market fit becomes very relevant. Of course, it becomes tough because there may not be a market, or like I said, you're perhaps creating a brand new market. So it's really about assessing the founder's skills and ability to get that done. As you move up, I think at a later stage, or say at a seed or Series A, you probably have a little bit more conviction or a clearer idea of what that market or that opportunity is, and you're really taking a bet on the product and the founder at that point, right? And as you go up, I'd say towards, say a Series A or Series B, what you're really thinking about at that point is, the product has sort of already kind of proved itself. There's early traction. There is, there's a customer base in place. There's some loyal clientele that they have. Users love them. And what you're really betting at that point is on their ability to scale exponentially. So I think a good way to look at it is that at the early stage, you're really betting on a founder and his idea and his vision for the world. At around a seed, you're betting on the ability to deliver an MVP to match that vision. At a Series A, you're betting on that MVP to turn into something that has the potential for scale. And everything beyond that, you're betting on the ability to scale and remain defensible.
Yeah, and be a real business, basically, at that point, obviously.
Yeah, hopefully.
No, and I mean, that's another point which I wanted to touch upon, was also the fact that a lot of this is banked on a lot of generic trends also. It's like there are some people who follow specific domains or sectors, and there have been trends over the years, right? I think there's been various trends we've seen VCs go after in the past 5 years. And whatever's been hot has been funded at that point, and some of them have really not worked out. So what's your take on that? like following these hype cycles?
Hype cycles will always exist. They'll always exist because I think that whether we like it or not, as human beings, we find it easier to build conviction around things that have more proof points. And for better or worse, proof points often mean comparables. So what's working outside, whether in China or the US, in a certain way ends up becoming a lens for us. And I actually don't see that changing too much over time. I think, cycle sharing companies have recently started getting funding in India, which really just blows my mind a little bit.
Bike sharing is the new food tech.
Yeah. I stayed away from food tech, and I'm very happy that I did. I've stayed away from hyperlocal, and I'm very happy that I did. So I think that trends and looking at trends and getting caught up in hype cycles is one of the most dangerous things that a VC can do. And I also believe that by the time you're investing in the sixth company that's doing that thing, I think you have a problem with your deal flow, and you need to reassess your ability to get quality deal flow as a VC. Unless there, of course, there are exceptions. Unless there's something very, very different about this product. Instead, I think a better way, or a way that's perhaps worked for me a little bit more, is thinking more about digital consumer user behavior trends and what is impacting them, right? So, for example, when we were talking about video early on, you very astutely brought up that geo is the reason that happened. And that's actually really true. And I think, geo really changed the landscape. And, I like to look out for trends like that. I like to look out for sort of infrastructure and ecosystem trends that I think, and then sort of extrapolate what I believe that will do to consumer behavior over time, and then take bets based on that. Simultaneously, I think another way of looking at it is perhaps thematic investing. At TIL, we've had this whole thought around toothbrush use cases, and what we mean by that is product, services, platforms that an Indian would use on a fairly regular basis, much like a toothbrush. So that can go across categories, that can go across sectors. But for me, thematic investing and thematic thesis creation is far more powerful. And as I think this is where perhaps my approach is the way it is because of my background as a designer. I'm an anomaly in the VC world, or designers in VC are just generally an anomaly because it's primarily a club of, of course, ex-entrepreneurs as well, but a lot of people from finance or consulting backgrounds or engineers that perhaps look at things in a very analytical way. And it's not that I don't look at things in an analytical way, but I think that there's a sort of qualitative aspect of how you understand the world and how you look at the world. And I fall back on my experience as a designer and being user-driven to really think about products and solutions and gaps that I see in the market. I sort of much like how, when building a product or a solution, a designer would sort of say, okay, here's the landscape of the world and here are the opportunities, and this is how I plan on solving for those opportunities. This is how I sort of plan on creating products or solutions to solve those large gaps that I see. As a VC, I just stop myself short of solving for those problems and instead say, what are the companies that I can find that I think can solve those problems? So I try to assess things from, for better or worse, perhaps, that's just my background, but from a user-driven way. And even in terms of where to invest and what to look at, I'm sort of even moving towards this idea or this notion of user-driven or user-based thesis creation, because we're finally at this reality where, you have all of these different user segments with unique behaviors in India. And, the user segments in India, even if it's say 5 or 10% of the digital population, that's still a substantial amount of people who are online. So can you build theses that are specific to user segments and user behaviors and start looking for companies that are solving those problems in areas?
Yeah, I think that's, you mentioned the fact that each of these segments, while they may be a few of them which matter, are quite voluminous, right? I mean, that's, I think, the India story also. The fact that, people who show a certain behavior are so many in number. And you can actually put them in segments and, qualify them for certain things and certain kinds of products. But that's an interesting aspect which you mentioned you bring to the table in terms of thinking user first, given a design background. What do you think of, and again, just to get under the skin of the PC and try to understand how it is on that side of the table, when some people come in from this purely analytical mindset, sometimes it's also a matter of clashing with what the founder typically brings is like a passion to the table, right? They say they're so passionate. Every founder is so passionate about what they believe in and what they're solving for. How do you, as the VC, sort of see through that or cut through that, and how do you complement a founder's passion by being a little analytical, I would say?
Sure. I think that it's not as much as VCs or investors being analytical, as much as I think because we have either invested in or worked with so many different companies at different stages, we have muscle memory. We do. In the sense that we've seen similar mistakes being made. We've seen what has happened in other places. And, it's not necessarily to curtail, it's never to curtail someone's passion, but I think it's about being able to offer experience and being able to offer the ability to help a founder, I'd say, processize in many ways. And at the same time, knowing exactly what to look for and what to look at. So if we tell founders to be more data-driven or be more analytical, I think it's because your passion only gets you to a certain stage, after which you have to be ruthlessly data-driven and process-driven for you to actually scale. And I think that's sort of how the best VCs like to work with companies. So, at the end of the day, I think that as an investor, for me personally, I'm never going to go in and start running someone's business. I mean, you've seen how I've worked with you guys at HipCask in the past. But I think that the way that I like to be able to offer founders the ability to pause and to really strategize. And what I mean by that is I think founders, when they're working on a daily basis, they're in the throes of things. They're constantly problem solving, they're firefighting, and they're being very, very reactive. And I think a good investor can help a founder pause and become a little bit more proactive. And that's where I think looking at the numbers, looking at analytics, looking at data, looking at your P&L, looking at your cost structures, that's all very important, because that helps you pause and it helps you become more proactive. And I think that that's the kind of work that I like to do with companies, of course, outside of the stuff that I do around product and design. But I think that's sort of what an investor should be thinking about, and that's how investors should be thinking about their role with companies.
Right. No, that's great. I think that's great insight. And obviously, the more founders are aware of how to address this, I think it's important to sort of pause at each of these stages of growth and address these specific, criteria.
Yeah, of course. And of course, this is my perspective. And, I'm also still learning. I've only been doing this for 3 years. A lot of my peers have been doing this far longer, but this is a continuous process for me to also learn how to be a better partner to companies. I mean, as cheesy as that may sound, but at the end of the day, you're signing up for a very long journey, and you want to be as helpful as possible. Right. So, for me, I'm constantly trying to learn from my peers, from my colleagues, from mentors that I have in the ecosystem on just how to be a more effective investor and partner to founders.
No, that's great, and I think that's a great input for current and future founders as well. Which brings me to, before we round this off, I wanted to quickly check, what do you think are, what's your outlook for, now that we're just at the start of 2018, what's your outlook for what's going to be hot this year or going forward, or what kind of founders are you looking at personally, or TIL, if you want to comment on that? What's important for you?
Sure. I mean, so TIL, of course, we're continuing to do the work that we've done, and what I mean by that is, working with very innovative companies at the early stage through our year-round incubator program that we have. We're looking for a lot of stuff. We're actually looking to support more and more deep tech companies. So what we mean by that is, companies that are doing stuff around AI, ML, blockchain, edge computing. Those are all areas, essentially infrastructure and sort of the pieces that will create the platforms of the future. That's sort of what we're looking to really take bets on at the earliest of stages. Later on, of course, we're also continuing to do all the work that we've done in terms of investing in more and more consumer businesses, and we'll look to do that across seed to Series B. And even at TIL, we've been in a situation where we've been relooking and rethinking about our strategy, and we're building things up. And I think this year is going to be a very exciting and active year for TIL and the investment team. There'll be more stuff to share down the line. Unfortunately, I can't share too much right now, but you can expect some exciting stuff from us coming ahead. For me personally, I think that, again, I like to stay away from sectors and team. I like to stay away from saying, okay, this sector is going to be hot this year because, it's just very hard to predict some of that. But I think there's still some large opportunities. I think that a lot of the work that Geo did, there's still a lot to be done on top of that. I think that this year may as well just be the year that we start seeing a lot of really effective products for the next 400, 500 million people who have now just come online or are in the process of coming online. So, and I think those are going to be real fundamental things. Those are going to be things like utilities. Those are going to be things like gaming. I think gaming itself is going to have huge potential now in India. There's always been a large gaming culture, but I think we're really starting to come of age, or we will be coming of age fairly soon. So especially social gaming, I think that gaming also is a very social activity in India, and not much of that is going to change when things start going online or getting into mobile apps. So I'm really hoping to see social gaming companies come about. On the other side, there's an area that has always remained close to my heart, which is internet first brands. And I personally am looking to invest in, and TIL, it's actually a very important part of our strategy now, is investing in internet-first brands. And those are companies like Blue Tokai, which is probably one of my more well-known investments.
The coffee company.
Where essentially... What's that?
The coffee company.
Yeah, the coffee.
Yeah, the coffee company, Blue Tokai Coffee Roasters. I was one of the first investors there. And, through my work with them, I've seen how there are certain there were certain barriers to creating a physical product brand that the internet has sort of completely obliterated in India. And that's stuff around distribution, that's stuff around customer acquisition, supply chain, getting a store online. So I think that there's still a lot of room in India for more and more of these internet-first brands to be created. And, I'm not talking about Warby Parker ripoffs, but I think that, whether that's in fashion or grooming and cosmetics, FMCG products, I think those are all areas that there could be really, really strong homegrown brands that are built. And that's very, very exciting to me personally. So I think that there's a large opportunity for that moving ahead. And that's one area that I'm personally spending quite a bit of time around. The other thing is fintech. I think fintech is still interesting. So it may have been very hot and slightly frothy last year. Mm-hmm. I think that there's still so many India-specific use cases that are still yet to be answered, and I think it has to do around stuff like investments. It has to do with things like
lending.
Lending, yeah, lending is huge.
UPI 2.0.
What's that?
UPI 2.0.
Yeah, I mean, maybe not UPI 2.0, but there are a lot of opportunities there as well. And again, I think it's founders in fintech in the fintech space really need to take a user-driven approach to thinking about even how to create financial products. I think that businesses of just creating some sort of platform where you're essentially providing leads to to NBFCs, those are not large. Those are not necessarily the best kind of businesses to build. Your defensibility is very low, and a lot of those sort of companies got investment last year. I think what's more exciting would be real India-specific product use cases for people who are perhaps unbanked. I think a lot of people are getting banked now, but people who were perhaps previously unbanked, people with zero to no credit history. How do we sort of include them in the financial process? How do we include them in the financial system? And solve for some of those things, right? CIBIL isn't going to solve the credit rating problem in India. We need better ways to make that happen. So I think fintech is still a fairly large space. So, if I think about spaces that are exciting for me, to sum that up, of course there's a plethora. Of course, I haven't even touched on content. Of course, that's something that we do well. Media and content is something we do well at TIL. That, of course, is an ever-increasing space. But I think that social for India in some way or form around live is very interesting, and that could be very exciting. So live streaming could be exciting. I think that fintech has a lot of opportunity still. Internet-first brands, of course, and then definitely gaming.
Nice. And definitely not bike sharing, unless we are all proven wrong.
Oh, God, no. I mean, I'd love to be proven wrong.
We could be.
I've been, I've been proven wrong many times, man. I'm in the job of being proven wrong, I feel. So, it's just, look, again, it's one of those things that ride sharing for who, right? If you have seriously, man.
I really want to get someone who's pro ride sharing to talk us through this, and I hope I can do that.
Yeah, we should find somebody, because you're right. We kind of market as much as we do food tech.
But yeah, maybe I will. But I think so. That's about it, man. I think this was a great show. Thanks so much for doing this, Rob.
Thanks for having me, guys. Thanks for having me.
A bunch of stuff. Where can people talk to you? Find you on Twitter?
I'm on Twitter at Soaib Grewal, so SOAIBGREWAL. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn as well. I'm fairly responsive on LinkedIn, especially if you're looking to pitch me. So I think Twitter, to be honest, is the best place to reach out.
Or else also on our Slack channel once you jump on board over there.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a Slack channel. Exciting.
There's a Slack channel. You can let me tell you how to get to that Slack channel. You should go to the ivmpodcast.com /Shunya One webpage, and over there's a button where you can request an invitation to the Slack channel. Send us an email, and we'll send you an invite.
Yep, and please, of course, to everyone listening in, don't forget to give us a nice rating on iTunes.
Yes, please.
And and you can catch us on the IBM Podcast website, app, or any other podcasting app you like.
Yep.
All right, thanks so much, Red. This was great. Hope to continue the conversation on Slack and on Twitter, and see you around when you are in Mumbai or
definitely. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks so much.
Take care.
As you can see, we have a podcast listener in his natural habitat. Millions of years of evolution have led him to this point. He's on his way to work, and listening to podcasts makes his miserable day better. He will now head to work and use all his knowledge to communicate with other colleagues and possibly future mates. You can find more of his species on ivmpodcasts.com, your one-stop destination where you can check out all the coolest Indian podcasts. Happy listening.